in the back of the high school auditorium, where the air always seemed a little thicker and smelled of old wood and floor polish, Clara stood. She was a small part of a much larger sound, a single thread woven into a rich vocal tapestry. For 3 years, this had been her place. Her safe harbor within the Oak Ridge Community Choir. She was an alto, a section known for providing the warm, foundational harmonies, and Clara was its quiet anchor. Her head was always bent, her eyes glued to the black notes on the white page of her sheet music, as if afraid they might float away if she dared to look up. Her lips barely moved, a secret smile playing on them only when a particularly beautiful chord resonated through the hall. To the casual observer, she was just another body in a sea of blue robes, a background element easily overlooked. But inside her head, a different concert was always playing. She didn't just read the notes, she felt them. Each harmony was a color, each rhythm a heartbeat. When the choir sang, she wasn't just blending in, she was listening, adjusting, and subtly supporting the voices around her. A silent guardian of the sound, the man on the podium, Mr. Davies, was a sculptor of sound, and his choir was his clay. He was a tall, thin man with sharp features and an even sharper ear. His hands, elegant and precise, would carve the air, shaping phrases and demanding perfection. He wasn't a cruel man, but his passion for music left little room for anything less than excellence. Altos, from the top of measure 32. His voice would cut through the room, sharp and clear. I need more warmth, more body. You're singing it like it's a funeral dirge, not a celebration. He would pace the stage, his gaze sweeping over the faces, missing the quiet concentration in the back row. He knew the altos sounded good, better than good most nights. He just didn't know why. He never saw the way Clara would lean slightly towards a struggling singer next to her, her own voice a soft, steady guide that helped them find their pitch. To him, she was simply a name on a roster, a reliable presence who never caused trouble and never demanded attention. She was, in his mind, perfectly adequate. And perfectly invisible. This year, however, something was different. The annual regional competition was just 2 months away, and Mr. Davies had chosen a piece that was breathtakingly ambitious. It was a complex, layered ballad that built to a stunning, heart-stopping solo in the final verse. This solo wasn't just a few pretty notes. It was the emotional core of the entire song, the moment that would make or break their performance. The moment he announced the solo, a ripple of excitement and fear went through the choir. For Clara, it was a jolt of pure electricity. Every night for weeks, she had been singing that solo in the privacy of her small apartment. She would wait until her neighbors were asleep, then she'd close all the windows, draw the curtains, and let her voice fill the tiny space. In her living room, with a worn-out blanket wrapped around her shoulders, she wasn't the timid girl from the back row. She was a storyteller. Her voice, free from the weight of expectation, would soar through the difficult runs and hold the long, powerful notes with a strength that surprised even herself. She knew every breath, every crescendo, every heartbreak of that melody. It felt like it had been written just for her. The thought of actually singing it in front of people, though, was a terrifying monster that lived in the pit of her stomach. The day of the auditions arrived, and the auditorium felt colder than usual. A nervous energy buzzed through the choir members as they waited their turn. One by one, the brave ones stepped forward. Some were good, some were okay, and some were spectacularly off-key. With each audition, Clara's hope dwindled, replaced by a familiar, cold dread. Her hands felt clammy, and she could feel her heart thumping a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. "Clara," Mr. Davies called out, his voice flat and businesslike. He didn't look at her with expectation, but with a sense of duty, as if ticking a name off a list. The walk from the back row to the center of the stage felt like the longest journey of her life. The wooden floor seemed to stretch for miles, and the bright stage lights felt like 100 interrogating eyes. She could feel the collective gaze of the entire choir on her back. She reached the lone microphone, its metal stand cold to the touch. She cleared her throat, but it made no difference. Her throat felt tight, as if her own fear was physically strangling her. She looked out at the sea of faces, then at Mr. Davies, who was already checking his watch. She opened her mouth to sing the first note, the one she had perfected 100 times in her living room. But what came out wasn't a note. It was a small, choked squeak, a pathetic gasp of air that was swallowed by the immense silence of the hall. A wave of heat washed over her face. She tried again, forcing the air from her lungs. But her vocal cords had frozen solid. Nothing, just a humiliating, deafening silence. Mr. Davies let out a long, weary sigh. It wasn't an angry sound, but one of profound disappointment, as if he'd expected this all along. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Next, the word was a final, brutal blow. It was a door slamming shut, the sound of a dream shattering into a million pieces. Clara stumbled back to her spot in the alto section, her cheeks burning with shame. She didn't dare look at anyone, convinced she could feel their pity and their relief that it wasn't them. She sank into her chair, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Later, as she was gathering her things to leave, she overheard him talking to his assistant near the piano. "She has a good heart, always on time, knows her part. But the stage fright is insurmountable," he said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "She never be a soloist. It's a waste of time to even consider it." The words echoed in Clara's ears all the way home. They weren't said with malice, but with a certainty that was somehow even more painful. That night, for the first time in months, she didn't sing. The sheet music for the solo lay on her coffee table, the notes looking like little black taunts. The music in her head had gone silent, replaced by the sound of that one horrible, failed squeak and the finality of Mr. Davies's words. He had decided, a background singer. And maybe she thought he was right. The days after the audition were a slow, quiet torture for Clara. Every rehearsal was a reminder of her failure. She would arrive early, take her usual spot in the back row, and lose herself in the music, but it wasn't the same. The joy had been replaced by a dull, persistent ache. She still sang her harmonies, her voice a steady, reliable presence in the alto section, but now it felt like she was going through the motions. The music was a language she loved, but she had been told she was only allowed to speak in whispers, never to shout. She watched as Mr. Davies worked with the chosen soloist, a young woman named Jessica who had a voice that was bright and powerful like a polished brass bell. Jessica was everything Clara was not, confident, outgoing, and seemingly without a shred of self-doubt. She walked onto the stage as if she owned it, her head held high, her smile practiced and perfect. As the weeks went by, the choir began to transform. The piece, once a collection of difficult notes and tricky rhythms, started to breathe. Under Mr. Davies's relentless guidance, it was taking shape, becoming the stunning performance he had envisioned. And Jessica's solo was the centerpiece. She sang it flawlessly, hitting every high note with precision and every run with a clean, technical skill that was undeniably impressive. Mr. Davies was pleased. He would nod in approval, a small, rare smile touching his lips. "That's it, Jessica. Power and control. That's what we need," he would say. But sometimes when Clara closed her eyes and just listened, she felt something was missing. Jessica's voice was perfect, like a beautifully painted picture, but it lacked a certain rawness, a certain vulnerability. It was technically brilliant, but it didn't quite tell the story of the song, the story of heartbreak and hope that Clara felt so deeply in her bones. During those moments, Clara would sing the harmony line while silently. Desperately, her heart sang the solo along with Jessica, pouring all the emotion she was holding back into the phantom melody in her head. The choir members were a tight-knit group, and they could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The excitement for the competition was building, a tangible energy that buzzed through the hallways. They knew this was their best shot at winning in years. For them, Jessica was their star, their secret weapon. They would compliment her after rehearsals, and she would accept their praise with a graceful nod. They were kind to Clara as they had always been, but there was a new distance. She was the girl who had tried and failed, the girl who couldn't handle the pressure. She was part of the team, but she wasn't a contender. She felt like a veteran player on a sports team who had been benched, forever watching from the sidelines. Still, she loved the sound they were making together. When the entire choir sang, blending their voices into one powerful, unified sound, she felt a sense of belonging that was worth the pain. In those moments, she wasn't the girl who had choked. She was just a part of something beautiful. The morning of the competition dawned bright and clear, a perfect day for a victory. The choir was scheduled to meet at the school to board a bus that would take them to the Grand Theater in the city. The air in the rehearsal hall was thick with a mix of last-minute jitters and exhilarating anticipation. People were adjusting their robes, humming their parts, and chattering nervously. Mr. Davies was walking through the crowd, his face a mask of intense focus, giving last-minute instructions. Clara stood near the back, just taking it all in, a quiet observer. She was happy for her friends, for the choir, even if a small part of her felt a pang of sadness for what could have been. Suddenly, Mr. Davies's phone rang, a sharp, intrusive sound that cut through the noise. He answered it with an impatient, "Hello?" As he listened, his face began to change. The confident, focused expression melted away, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, and finally a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He ended the call without saying goodbye, his hand dropping slowly to his side. The room fell silent, everyone turning to look at him, their smiles fading. "That was Jessica's mother," he said, his voice strangely flat. "Jessica woke up this morning and she can't speak. She has lost her voice completely. The doctor says it's a severe case of laryngitis." A collective gasp went through the room. It was as if someone had sucked all the air out. For a moment, nobody moved. The news was so unbelievable, so catastrophic, that it didn't seem real. Their star, their secret weapon, was gone. Just like that, Mr. Davies began to pace, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "No, no, no," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "This can't be happening." He looked at the faces of his choir members, all of them staring back at him with wide, panicked eyes. He saw months of hard work, of sacrifice and dedication, crumbling before him. The mood on the bus was somber, the complete opposite of the excited chatter that had been planned. The reality of their situation had sunk in, and it was bleak. The solo was the emotional heart of their entire performance. Without it, the song was just an empty shell. They could try to have the whole choir sing the solo line, but it would lack the power and the intimacy. It would sound weak, and the judges would notice. Mr. Davies sat at the front, staring out the window, his jaw set in a hard line. He was a man who prided himself on his preparation, his ability to anticipate every problem. But this was an act of God. He had spent the entire morning frantically trying to come up with a solution, calling other choir directors, searching for an alternative arrangement, but there was none. There was no time. They were a ship without a rudder, sailing directly into a storm. When they arrived at the Grand Theater, the energy of the place was overwhelming. Other choirs were milling about, their laughter and music filling the cavernous space. But for the Oak Ridge Choir, it was like walking into a funeral. They found their designated rehearsal room, a small, windowless space that felt like a cage. Mr. Davies finally turned to face them, his face grim. "We will cut the solo," he announced, his voice heavy with defeat. "We will rearrange the ending on the spot. The sopranos will carry the line as a group. We will go out there, and we will be professional, and we will hold our heads high. But we will not win." The words hung in the air, a final, crushing sentence. The fight was over before it had even begun. The backstage area of the Grand Theater was a world controlled by controlled chaos. People in formal wear and stage makeup rushed past each other, shouting cues and last-minute instructions. The air buzzed with a strange electricity, a mix of hairspray, sweat, and raw anticipation. From behind the heavy velvet curtains, you could hear the muffled sound of another choir performing, their distant applause a constant reminder of the competition roaring on without them. But inside the small, designated rehearsal room assigned to the Oak Ridge Choir, there was a different kind of energy. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of defeat. The choir members sat in scattered chairs, their blue robes looking dull and lifeless under the harsh fluorescent lights. No one spoke. No one hummed their parts. They just stared at the floor, at the walls, at anything but each other. as if meeting another's gaze would confirm the shared nightmare they were all living. Mr. Davies stood in the center of the room, his back to them, looking at a whiteboard where he had hastily scribbled the new, simplified arrangement. His shoulders were slumped, a posture no one had ever seen from him before. He was a man who stood straight as a ruler, his posture a reflection of his unwavering discipline. But now he looked smaller, older. He had spent the entire bus ride and the last hour in this room trying to find a magical solution, a way to save their performance. But there was none. The solo was the heart of the song, and without it, they were just a body without a soul. He had already accepted it. He had already delivered the news. Now he was just waiting for the clock to run out. The feeling of helplessness was a bitter taste in his mouth. He had pushed them, driven them to perfection, only to have it all undone by something as simple and stupid as a sore throat. It felt like a cosmic joke. Clara sat in her usual spot in the corner, almost blending into the shadows. She felt the weight of the room's despair pressing down on her, a physical force that made it hard to breathe. Her heart ached for her friends. She saw the young man who usually sat next to her, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly. She saw the older woman who always shared her cough drops, staring blankly at the wall, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. They had all poured so much of themselves into this music. They had sacrificed evenings and weekends, had fought through colds and fatigue, all for this one moment. And now that moment was stolen from them. A wave of pity washed over her, so strong it almost brought her to tears. But then something else began to bubble up from deep inside her, something hot and sharp. It was anger. A fierce, burning anger at the unfairness of it all. It wasn't just about losing the competition. It was about seeing the joy, the passion, the very life drain out of the people she cared about. All their hard work, all their belief in the music was about to be thrown away. She thought about the song. She could hear it in her head. Not the broken version they were about to perform, but the complete, whole version. She could hear the beautiful harmonies of the choir, and then, rising above it all, the solo. She saw herself in her small apartment, the music filling the room, her voice free and unafraid. She knew that solo. She knew every nuance, every breath, every ounce of emotion it held. She had lived with that song for months. It was a part of her. The thought of it being butchered, of its heart being ripped out, was unbearable. The anger inside her grew, pushing aside the fear that had been her constant companion for so long. The fear of being seen, of being heard, of failing. Suddenly, failing on her own seemed less terrifying than watching everyone else fail together. Before she could talk herself out of it, she was on her feet. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, but she forced them to move, one step at a time, across the cold linoleum floor. The few heads that were upturned to look at her, their expressions curious. She walked directly towards Mr. Davies, who was still staring at the whiteboard. She stopped a few feet behind him, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. "Mr. Davies?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't turn around. "What is it, Clara?" he asked, his voice tired and flat. "We're about to line up." She took a small step closer. "I know the solo," she said, a little louder this time. He finally turned around, and the look on his face was one of utter disbelief, mixed with a flicker of annoyance. "Clara, this is not the time for jokes," he said, his voice sharp. "I don't have the patience." "I'm not joking," she insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She met his gaze, and for the first time she didn't look away. "I know every note. I've been practicing it for months. I can do it." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Do it, Clara? I heard you at the audition. You couldn't even get one note out. We are 10 minutes from going on stage. This is not a rehearsal." He turned his back on her again, dismissing her completely. "Go back to your spot." The rejection stung, a hot, familiar pain. But the anger was still there, fueling her. She didn't move. "I was scared," she said, her voice clear and steady now. "I'm still scared. But I know I can do it. Please, don't let all our work be for nothing." He slowly turned back to face her, his eyes narrowing. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in a long time. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he saw something else too. A fire, a desperation that mirrored his own. He was a man who was out of options. His plan was a plan for failure, a way to lose with dignity. But what if? The thought was crazy, reckless. It went against every instinct he had as a director. But the look in her eyes gave him pause. "Prove it," he said, his voice low and challenging. He gestured towards an empty corner of the room, away from the others. "You have one note. The first note of the solo. That's all I have time for." Clara's heart was pounding so fast she felt dizzy. This was it. All or nothing. She walked to the corner he had pointed to, the small space feeling as vast and terrifying as an empty stadium. She closed her eyes, shutting out the worried faces of her friends, the skeptical face of her director. She took a deep breath, just like she did in her apartment. She thought about the song, about the story it told. She thought about the hope that was supposed to bloom in that final verse. And then she sang. The note that came out was not the small, choked squeak from the audition. It was a clear, pure, and shockingly powerful tone that seemed to cut through the heavy silence of the room. It was a note filled with all the years of unspoken song, all the quiet harmonies, all the secret dreams. It was a note that held the pain of their current situation and the fierce, unyielding hope for a miracle. The note hung in the air, perfect and shimmering, for a long second after she stopped singing. In the room you could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was staring at her, their mouths slightly agape. Mr. Davies stood frozen, his eyes wide with astonishment. He saw not the frightened girl from the audition, but a performer. He saw the sound he had been trying to sculpt for months, standing right in front of him. He didn't smile. He didn't say a word. He just gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. "Get on the mark," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You're on?" The words "you're on" hung in the air, a command and a lifeline all at once. For a split second, nobody moved. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Then the room erupted. It wasn't a cheer, but a frantic, whispered scramble of activity. The choir members, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning hope, rushed to get into their formation on the stage. Someone gently pushed Clara towards the center, towards the single microphone stand that stood like a sentinel under the bright lights. Her hands were shaking so badly that she had to clasp them together to stop them from fluttering like frightened birds. A stagehand with a headset gave her a quick, encouraging nod before motioning for the choir to move forward. The heavy velvet curtains began to part, revealing the vast, dark expanse of the Grand Theater. Walking to the center of that stage was the longest, most terrifying journey of Clara's life. Each step felt heavy, as if she were walking through thick mud. The spotlight hit her with a physical force, a warm, blinding glare that turned the audience into a single, monstrous entity of shadowed faces. The sheer size of the hall was overwhelming. It was a cavern, a giant mouth waiting to swallow her whole. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. The familiar cold dread of the audition began to creep back into her veins. What if she choked again? What if that one perfect note was just a fluke? What if she let everyone down, not just by failing, but by giving them a false hope? She could feel the hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, and the weight of their expectations was crushing as she reached the microphone. She risked a quick glance back at her fellow choir members. They were arranged in their perfect rows, their blue robes a sea of calm in the storm. But their faces were anything but calm. They were looking at her with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't pity. It wasn't doubt. It was a fragile, desperate trust. She saw the young man from the alto section give her a tiny, determined nod. She saw the older woman mouth the words, "You can do it." In their eyes, she wasn't the background singer who had failed. She was their only chance. She looked past them into the wings and saw Mr. Davies. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were locked on hers, intense and unwavering. He had taken a gamble on her, a reckless last-minute gamble, And now they were both all in. The soft, opening notes of the introduction began to float from the orchestra pit. The sound was beautiful and familiar, a comfort in the face of her terror. Clara closed her eyes, shutting out the intimidating darkness of the hall. She took a deep, slow breath, just like she had done 1,000 times in the safety of her living room. She remembered the feeling of the worn blanket around her shoulders, the quiet hum of her refrigerator, the way the music would fill the small space and make it feel like a cathedral. She wasn't on a stage in front of 1,000 people. She was at home, singing a song she loved, a song that was a part of her. The moment for the solo arrived. She opened her mouth, and the first phrase came out. It was a little shaky, her voice trembling slightly with the last vestiges of her fear. It was a small, uncertain sound in the vast hall, but then something incredible happened. As she felt the music flow through her, as she heard the gentle, supportive harmonies of the choir swelling behind her, a warmth spread through her chest. The fear began to melt away, replaced by a feeling she had only ever experienced when she was alone. It was a feeling of freedom. Her voice, no longer timid and hesitant, began to grow. It was no longer just a collection of notes. It was a story. She wasn't just singing the melody. She was living it. She poured all of her hidden hopes, her secret dreams, her quiet frustrations, and her fierce love for the music into every single word. Her voice, clear and resonant, soared through the difficult runs and held the long, powerful notes with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, a place she never knew existed. In the wings. Mr. Davies felt his breath catch in his throat. He had expected a competent, perhaps passable, performance. He had hoped she wouldn't embarrass herself or the choir. But what he was hearing was something else entirely. It was technically flawless, yes, but it was more than that. It was filled with a raw, honest emotion that he had never been able to coax from any of his singers. He listened to the way she shaped a phrase, the way she let her voice break just slightly on a word about heartbreak, the way it soared with pure joy on the line about hope. He saw not the frightened girl from the audition, but a true artist, a storyteller. He realized with a jolt that all this time, he had been so focused on the technical perfection of the sound that he had completely missed the heart of it. And the heart had been standing in the back row all along. The choir members felt it too. They were no longer just accompanying a soloist. They were being lifted by her. Her voice was a current, and they were all riding it. They sang their harmonies with a new passion and power, their voices blending with hers to create a sound more beautiful and more profound than anything they had ever achieved in rehearsal. They were no longer just a group of singers. They were a single, breathing entity, united by the miracle happening at the center of the stage. When Clara held the final, powerful note of the solo, a note that seemed to last for an eternity, the entire hall was silent for a breathtaking beat. It was a silence filled with awe. Then the silence was shattered by a wave of thunderous applause that was so sudden and so loud it felt like a physical force. The choir joined in, their voices swelling around hers for the final, triumphant bars of the song. The sound they created was massive, a wall of pure, glorious sound that filled every corner of the theater. As the last chord faded into silence, Clara stood there, her body trembling, her mind blank. The spotlight was still on her, but it no longer felt blinding. It felt warm, like a hug. She could hear the applause, but it sounded distant, as if she were underwater. She slowly opened her eyes, which she hadn't realized were closed, and looked out at the sea of faces. They were no longer a monstrous shadow. They were individuals standing up, their faces filled with emotion, their hands clapping. She had done it. She had faced her deepest fear and had not just survived, but had soared. She looked back at her friends, who were now beaming at her, their faces shining with pride and tears of joy. And then she looked at Mr. Davies, who was standing in the wings, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. It was a smile of profound respect, a silent acknowledgement that he had been wrong, and that he had just witnessed something truly extraordinary. The sound was a physical thing, a wave of warmth and energy that washed over the stage. It was the roar of 1,000 people on their feet, a sound so loud it seemed to make the very air vibrate. For Clara, it was all a blur. The spotlight that had once felt like an interrogating eye now felt like a warm, golden blanket. She could see the faces in the audience, not as a single, shadowy monster, but as individual expressions of joy, of surprise, of shared emotion. Her mind was strangely quiet, the frantic drumbeat of panic replaced by a serene, humming stillness. She felt a gentle hand on her back, guiding her towards the wings. As she turned, the rest of the choir was moving with her, their faces shining with a light she had never seen before. They were a unit, bound together by what had just happened. The walk off the stage was a dream. The roar of the crowd followed them, a constant, thunderous affirmation. The moment they stepped behind the heavy velvet curtains, the world exploded. It was a chaos of hugs, tears, and joyful shouts. The choir members, who had been slumped in defeat just an hour ago, were now a whirlwind of pure elation. They were grabbing each other, laughing and crying at the same time. And then they turned to Clara. Before she knew what was happening, strong hands were lifting her up. Suddenly, she was on their shoulders, high above the crowd, looking down at the beaming, upturned faces of her friends. They were chanting her name, a rhythmic, powerful roar that was even more overwhelming than the applause of the audience. Clara! 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 In that moment, she wasn't the quiet girl from the back row. She wasn't the girl who had choked at her audition. She was their hero. A tear slid down her cheek, a tear of pure, unadulterated happiness. She felt a sense of belonging so complete, so profound, that it filled every empty space inside her that she had ever known. The euphoria carried them through the next tense hour. All the competing choirs were gathered in a large waiting area, a space buzzing with nervous energy and whispered predictions. The Oak Ridge Choir, however, was a bubble of quiet confidence. They had already won. No matter what the judges said, they had experienced something far more valuable than a trophy. They had created a moment of magic. They sat together in a corner, their blue robes a sea of calm in the storm. Clara was in the middle of them now, no longer on the edges. People would reach out and squeeze her hand or give her a little smile. She saw Mr. Davies standing a little ways off, talking to another director, but he kept glancing over at his group, a small, unreadable expression on his face. Clara didn't feel nervous anymore. She felt a deep, abiding peace. She had done what she set out to do. She had sung the song the way it was meant to be sung, and she had shared it with the people she cared about most. That was enough. Finally, an official-looking person with a clipboard stepped onto a small stage and called for everyone's attention. The room fell silent. He began to announce the results, starting with the smaller awards. And the award for Best Choral Arrangement goes to... The list went on, each announcement met with polite applause from some and disappointed sighs from others. Clara barely heard him. She was just soaking in the feeling of being there, surrounded by her friends, her heart still humming with the memory of the music. Then came the moment they were all waiting for. And now, the announcer said, his voice building with drama, the award for overall grand champion of the regional competition. He opened the envelope. A long, dramatic pause. The Oak Ridge Community Choir. For a second there was stunned silence. Then the Oak Ridge Choir erupted. It was a sound of pure, unbridled joy, a release of all the tension, fear, and hope of the past few months. They hugged, they screamed, they jumped up and down. Mr. Davies made his way through the crowd, a huge, uncharacteristic grin on his face. He was holding a large, gleaming trophy. He handed it to two of the senior members, but then his eyes found Clara. He walked over to her, his expression softening. "We couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. That was something I will never forget. The choir made their way back onto the grand stage, this time not as performers, but as champions. They stood under the bright lights, the trophy held high, the applause washing over them once more. But this time it felt different. It wasn't just applause for a good performance. It was an acknowledgement of their journey, of their comeback story, later. After the celebration had died down and the choir was back in their rehearsal room, packing up their things to go home, Clara felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. It was Mr. Davies. The room was mostly empty now, just a few people lingering. "Clara, can I have a word?" he asked. His tone was serious and her stomach did a little flip. She followed him to the corner of the room, away from everyone else. He didn't look at her right away. He looked at the floor, as if gathering his thoughts. He was a man who was always in control, always had the right words. But now he seemed hesitant, almost vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," he finally said, his voice low. "A big one." He looked up and his eyes met hers. They were filled with a sincerity that was so intense it took her breath away. "I was wrong about you. I was arrogant and I was blind. I spent years listening to this choir and I thought I knew what I was hearing. But I was only listening for the things I expected to hear. I never bothered to listen for the person." He took a deep breath. "That day at the audition, I saw your fear and I made a judgment. I put you in a box and I locked the door. I told myself I was being practical, being a good director. But I was just being lazy. I was taking the easy way out. What you did tonight, it wasn't just a great performance. It was a lesson. A lesson in humility and a lesson in listening. You reminded me why we do this in the first place. It's not about technical perfection. It's about heart. And you, Clara, have more heart than anyone I have ever met." He didn't offer any excuses. He didn't try to soften his words. He just laid his mistake bare with a raw honesty that meant more to Clara than any flowery speech. "I am profoundly sorry," he finished, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for proving me wrong." Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of joy or sadness. They were tears of understanding, of forgiveness. She just nodded, unable to speak. In the months that followed, everything changed. The story of the Oak Ridge Choir's comeback spread, and Clara became a local celebrity. But more importantly, she became a new person. She was no longer the quiet girl in the back row. She was the choir's featured soloist, her voice a source of pride and inspiration for the entire group. She walked with a new confidence, her head held high, a smile always ready on her face. The fear of the stage was gone, replaced by a love for the connection she felt with the audience. She started taking formal voice lessons, and her teacher was amazed by her natural ability and her willingness to learn. She even began writing her own songs, simple melodies filled with the same raw emotion that had captivated the theater that night. She had proven one man wrong with a single note, but in doing so, she had proven something far more important to herself, that her voice, quiet as it was, deserved to be heard. And she was just getting started.